Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to discuss a new set of sanctions that have been introduced by the United States targeted towards Syria. They were implemented June 17th, the sort of first rollout of this new type of sanction. And honestly, I can't think of a better way to describe this program of sanctions than evil. I think it's an evil thing, and that's not a word that I use very often. For those of you who are new here, we start off with a sort of half hour, 45 minutes, sometimes longer presentation by me. I'll talk about whatever the main topic of the day is, and then we do Q&A. We do questions and answers, and I will deal with any questions you may have and attempt to answer them. The Q&A does not start until I've stopped my presentation, and I don't have the mental bandwidth to go back and look at questions you may have asked before I started the Q&A period, so please answer your questions again. Yeah, if you're familiar with the super chat function where folks send a little money my way, which I'm very grateful for, I do tend to answer all of those super chat questions. And I'll answer any of the other questions that I can. The moderator today, as it has been for most of this year, is Logo Cool Extreme. If he tells you that you are out of line, listen to him, because if you don't listen to him, he will block you. That's a semi-permanent thing, unless you make a really great argument to me or Logo. So listen to Logo. The rules are pretty simple. We have a really wide discourse here. You can talk about pretty much anything. However, you can be as negative about me as you want. You can go crazy. Yeah, my beard's too long. Whatever. But I ask that you not attack each other and that you not be disruptive to the chat in general. If you do that, Logo will argue. If you do that, then Logo will warn you, and then he will block you. So please don't do either of those things. Don't disrupt the chat. Don't be abusive to each other. You can be abusive to political figures. You can be abusive to me. Just go nuts, but not to each other. I think with that, we will dive into it. Haven't been talking about Syria much because, unfortunately, it's sort of fallen into this really grim, I guess not status quo, because it just gets grimmer and grimmer. It falls deeper and deeper, and I'll talk a little bit more about Syria's developing economic crisis later on in the talk. But it's been clear for years what the result of the Syrian civil war was going to be. Syrian civil war could be a misnomer. It's a proxy war. It's a war that the United States started against Syria, a country that is one of the only allies of Russia and Iran. And in response, Russia and Iran decided to devote a lot of resources to supporting that ally, the Assad government in Syria. The United States has been one of the main motivating factors behind this conflict since it began in 2011. And what I'm talking about today is the next step in this ongoing onslaught against the Syrian people. Because no matter how much they claim that these attempts are aimed against the Syrian regime, whether it was the funding of the jihadists, whether it was the setting up of that independent Kurdish state, whether it was taking the oil. I mean, actually, nobody has a defense for that. Whatever the policy has been, the people who have suffered the most are the Syrian people. It's not the regime. People can argue back and forth on that. There's a lot of, certainly the people who wrote this Caesar Act, this not just ironically, just malevolently entitled the Caesar Civilian Protection Act, which is utter horseshit. People who authored this act, who I would argue, whether or not they know it, are doing evil. These people would argue that it's a carefully targeted system of sanctions, and it's not going to affect, humanitarian aid, and it's to help the people. That's utter horseshit. It's interesting. I was reading a long article in Brookings that defended this, and it was interesting because he was like, yeah, like they actually acknowledged in the Brookings article. I should link it in the description. They're like, yeah, these sanctions will guarantee that no rebuilding can happen, that the Assad regime will not have the resources necessary to rebuild the country. So while there is some dispute, you can go back and forth. I believe it to be horseshit when the authors of the Caesar Act say that it's a targeted sort of thing that's only going to go against regime figures, not against the Syrian people. I believe that to be horseshit. But whether you want to, no matter what side of the argument you're on, nobody, not even the Brookings Institution, a super bloodthirsty think tank that just wants to kill Syrian people, even they can't dispute the fact that these sanctions are guaranteed to make reconstruction in Syria impossible. So whether or not these are going to actively starve Syrian people to death, these Syrian sanctions, these Caesar sanctions, whether or not they're actually going to do that, I believe they will. You might believe that they're somehow better targeted because you're a fantasist of some sort, but nobody on any side of that question disputes that this will keep any Syrian reconstruction from happening. This will go after any company that tries to work with the entity that is in control of, like, I think it's 80% of the territory of Syria now, and certainly like 80 to 90% of the population of Syria. So essentially, the Caesar Civilian Protection Act is the Syria Reconstruction Barring Act. That's what it's for. It's to make sure that nobody can reconstruct Syria. So what this is the United States has failed. The United States has failed in its 9-year attempt to destroy the Syrian government. So now they're basically saying, we've failed through the funding of jihadists. We've failed to get the American people on board with actually invading and destroying Syria the way we destroyed Iraq. So we're just going to do this sanctions thing that nobody is really going to pay too much attention to. And the only people who do pay attention to it are warmongers at like Brookings or Fox News or the New York Times, who are going to applaud us for starving the country to death. And it's extraordinary. Like, I almost never use the term evil, but thinking more and more about this, it's evil. It's truly horrific. And one way that these sanction programs function, and this is very similar to what's being done to Iran right now, this is very similar to what's being done to Venezuela, is these are like war. These are like tickets. These are like tickets for war. These are commitments to war that the United States is making, because they are guarantees that it's been demonstrated over and over and over again that sanctions, or at least the sanctions as they're implemented now, are essentially worthless. The Iranian regime has been sanctioned for 40 years. It's still there. Saddam Hussein was sanctioned very heavily between 1991 and 2003. We actually had to go in and murder 500,000 Iraqis to get him out. That's the same thing, sanctions have proven to be useless in Venezuela. And they have proven, because it's important to point out, Assad wasn't just sanctioned starting in 2011. There have been serious sanctions against Assad and his government since 2004. So in 2004, those sanctions were put on, and what they were like a placeholder. Like, we're going to make things worse in this country. We're going to make the U.S. relationship with this country much, much worse. And it's just sort of, we're going to keep it there to guarantee that things go very poorly in this country. And it's a place we'll be able to intervene in later. We'll be able to have a war with this country later if we put sanctions on it, because it'll stay so miserable. And that's what this sort of the Caesar sanction thing is designed to do. It's to create a permanent state of hell for the Syrians, so they will overthrow Assad. Of course, if they overthrow Assad, what they're going to get is the Al-Qaeda that the U.S. government has been funding, the jihadists that the U.S. government has been funding, for 9, 10 years. So we're basically saying you have to choose to live in a jihadist hell state rather than under this abusive but secular dictator you've had. Or we're just going to make sure there's no economic development in your country. You're not going to be able to do any kind of recovery. Oh, and also none of those refugees will ever be able to come back because there's no economic development in their country and there's nothing to come back to. And that's I think that's a really important point. Like sanctions, the way they're implemented now, like sanctions are, I don't want to be incredibly sweeping and be say though they're always evil and stupid and they can never do anything. Sanctions have been useful. Sanctions, Obama's use of sanctions when he actually was willing to do the diplomatic work necessary to get everybody on board with those sanctions worldwide. Those sanctions drove Iran to the negotiating table and created the landmark arms reduction deal. That worked in the 1980s. I think starting in the 1980s, sanctions against South Africa were tremendously significant and important. I don't think the U.S. Started sanctioning South Africa until way too late. But broader boycotts and sanctions against South Africa led to the end of the apartheid system there. The sanctions tool isn't necessarily evil or pointless. It's just the way that the United States has used that sanctions tool is both evil and pointless. And that's what we're doing. We're putting a permanent, like, we're going to go to war with you, a sticker on Syria. So sure, like we can't convince the American people, just like throughout the 90s, the U.S. government couldn't convince the American people to invade and take over Iraq. The sanctions were maintained to keep Iraq in this horrible, horrible situation that we could save them from. I mean, that's the really evil thing here is that we are crushing Syria with these sanctions. We've been crushing Syria with sanctions since. I mean, in 2004, I haven't looked into the details. Maybe you could argue if those sanctions were particularly targeted, maybe those were a good idea. But certainly since 2011, we have been crushing Syria with sanctions to make them more miserable to justify a later invasion. In the 90s, the U.S. public couldn't be convinced by the U.S. government to invade Iraq. We had to wait for the politics to change, and 9/11 obviously changed those politics. And that's what these sanctions do, and that's the thing about it that's just so evil. It is creating misery that the U.S. can then use to justify creating the horrific misery of an invasion. And it is so frustrating to see that over and over and over again. So to talk about the Caesar sanctions in particular, I had a hunch that this is what it was, and I've been researching all morning, and I think this is how they are different. Sanctions against the Syrian government, specific figures within the Syrian government, Syrian economy in general. There's been a wide battery of sanctions. I should definitely make a note to talk about how sanctions are never limited to what they say they're about. But there's been a wide range of sanctions against the Syrian people, not officially against the Syrian people, but against Syrian government, Syrian regime figures. That's been going on since 2004 and much more intensely since 2011, 2012. By the way, very quickly after the beginning of this uprising in February 2011, there was already a fresh slew of sanctions from the United States in April of 2011. So very clear that our involvement in this Syrian conflict was very big from like 2 months into the conflict. But so these have always been here. One thing that hasn't been the case with the Syria sanctions to as large a degree, I'm not entirely sure it hasn't at all been the case, is that they were not secondary sanctions. Those of you who are familiar with my series on Iran sanctions know that what makes those so malicious is the fact that they are not primary sanctions, which is saying, well, nobody under U.S. jurisdiction is allowed to do business with this country or entity. They are secondary sanctions, which is where the United States government tells everybody in the world that they're not allowed to do business with this sanctioned entity, which is kind of crazy because that's basically the United States making laws for everybody in the world. And people say we don't have a U.S. empire. So that's what makes the Iran sanctions so brutal, and so not brutal and nasty, but just so stupid and so guaranteed to piss off the whole world, is the fact that it's U.S. laws that the U.S. government has decided that they can implement against any business person in the world, even if they're not American, don't do any business with the United States, don't have anything to do with the United States. The secondary sanction aspect was not such a big deal with the U.S. Syria sanction policy up until this point. What the Caesar Civilian Protection Act does is it introduces secondary sanctions to the U.S. sanction regime against Syria. So that means that with the Caesar Act, starting June 17th of this year, this month, starting June 17th, the United States is now going to start going after anybody who does business with these elements. So if you are a Japanese, Iranian, Chinese, European, no, it wouldn't be Turkish at this point, but if you're in from any country that chooses to go and help rebuild Damascus, and if you have any kind of involvement, because of the nature of government in Syria, it's guaranteed. If you have any involvement with somebody who's on the secondary sanction list, then that country from Denmark is not allowed to go rebuild that neighborhood in Damascus. Because if they do, the full weight of the US government will come against them. That's what the Caesar Act does. It says not only are we going to keep anybody in the US from doing any kind of business or any kind of reconstruction of Syria, the Caesar Act guarantees that nobody in the world can do any business to help reconstruct Syria, which is just insane. So that's what's different here. Now that gets into sort of there's a lot of nuance here that I'm overlooking. Just the fact that primary sanctions, the United States saying that nobody who's under U.S. jurisdiction in a normal international law sense can do business with Syria, has a lot more impact than just that. It doesn't just mean that Johnny from Texas can't do business deals with Syria. It also means that Johnny from New York, who's a banker, doesn't want to do any business with Syria, and probably a lot of Europeans are not going to want to do business with Syria because they have business with Johnny the banker, and they don't want to screw things up. So I think it overstates it a little to say that this is when the secondary sanctions begin, because I think it blurs the line between primary and secondary sanctions, or rather, those lines should be blurry, is what I'm saying. I want to blur those lines between primary and secondary sanctions more than my explanation thus far has done so, because even with just the ruinous sanctions that the United States has been imposing on Syria since 2011, 2012, tremendous amounts of normal business with the world community at large have been not something that Syria can do. An interesting thing here is that I think Europe is actually pretty on board with our sanctioning of Syria. I haven't seen any protest. I could be wrong about this. I haven't seen any European protests about the Caesar Act, but that actually, unfortunately, I have a hunch that kind of fits. Whereas since Trump took the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal and reinstated secondary sanctions against Iran, meaning started threatening to go after European companies that dealt with Iran, there's been a massive outcry from Europe. That massive outcry from Europe has to do with the fact that there are 80 million Iranians and a large petrochemical industry and a large range of businesses that the Europeans can benefit from. Poor, destroyed Syria, I don't think anybody in Europe really cares that much. So it's not surprising that there hasn't been a European pushback against these Caesar sanctions. And also the sort of propaganda war against Syria against the Syrian government has been so incredibly effective that I think the Europeans are, or rather, to compare it the other way, I think the propaganda war that the Trump people have waged against Iran has been so spectacularly ineffective that there's actually finally some pushback against our secondary sanction practices there. Syria, I don't expect there to be much European pushback. There will be Russian pushback. There will be Iranian pushback. The problem, and I think part of the reason why these sanctions are coming now, is that Russia and Iran are in such disarray that the fact that they'll be willing to push back, it doesn't really have much effect, unfortunately. Just again on the sanctions, they are never as limited as they're portrayed, and that is true in every case. That is true with U.S. sanctions against Venezuela. That is true with U.S. sanctions against Iran, Syria, etc. There are specific carve-outs in every single one of these. I was reading some of the orders earlier. I was interested to see there's actually carve-outs for remittances, which is actually tremendously important. For at least in some of the earlier Syrian executive orders or earlier U.S. executive orders on Syria, they do have carve-outs for remittances. Like if people are living in another country and they're supporting their family back home, then remittances are still allowed. I was surprised and pleased to see that. So there are many and I'm not sure that's still the case with the Caesar Act. I've not read the Caesar Act in detail. It's quite possible that remittances are now difficult too. It wouldn't surprise me because the United States government's treatment of Syria is evil. So there's all these carve-outs for humanitarian stuff. We see this a lot with Iran, where it's like there's no acknowledgement that the economy is connected. Like if the Iranians if you're successfully crushing 95% of the Iranian economy, and you're saying, oh, but no. Like, that 5% of money you were going to spend on medical goods, that's cool. That's fine. It's like, well, buddy, if you're crushing 95% of the Iranian economy, then the foreign currency that they were going to use for medicine, they're going to use for food, or maybe they're going to use them for missiles because you keep threatening to invade and destroy them. So yeah, like this idea that you can just if you do the humanitarian carve-outs, like everybody's going to be fine is just horseshit. And I think that's really something worth focusing on. But again, like even if you believe that all these humanitarian carve-outs work out just fine, and these are really just surgical, carefully targeted things, there's no disputing that the Caesar Civilian Protection Act is a 100% guarantee that Syria will be completely unable to rebuild from this war. The Caesar Civilian Protection Act is a guarantee of Syrian poverty going forward, and it's sick. It's disgusting, and it is a sore loser using its near infinite financial power to crush a country that it has been murdering for 10 years. I'm a little angry about this. But yeah, anybody trying to, and what's I think important to mention here is, yes, the contemptible State Department communique that released this on the world you can smell Mike Pompeo on it. You can smell that sort of Trumpish just complete contempt for facts and common sense and morality. You can see that in the announcement there. But the Caesar Act is not just a Trumpish thing. Absolutely not. It is on. Damn it! I didn't see who the co-sponsors were, but I'm sure there's some hawkish Democratic co-sponsor for the. Yes, absolutely. It was the New Jersey guy, the corrupt Democratic New Jersey guy. What's his name? Bob Menendez. Yeah, it was a co-sponsor of this. So this is not. Don't ever let anybody tell you that all the evil shit that the United States is doing on the world is just a Trump thing, because this is very much a bipartisan Washington, D.C. creation. I've talked about that a lot. By the way, like if all of this seems weird to you and you're like, wait, why are you? Huh? I thought Assad is a bad man. Different. That's a different discussion. I thought Assad was evil and everything we were doing against him was great. Then you should probably watch at the top of my YouTube channel. I just put up my very long Syria playlist And I think I put like the 3 most useful videos up at the top of that playlist. You should go over there and watch that because I think we're just really like we're just constantly told lies about this conflict. Have been for a decade. I'm not saying that it did start out in 2011. There was a legitimate peaceful protest movement, very briefly, against Assad. He did do brutal things to that. The Assad regime is brutal. Assad is a bad man, but it was the U.S. policy of destroying the Syrian government and destroying the Syrian people that turned Assad into a mass murderer. Anyway, sorry, but you should check out the playlist for all the details on that. Back to the specifics of this Caesar Act. This is not just a Trump thing. This is an everybody thing. The Brookings Institution, which is portrayed as a more liberal, sort of liberal establishment, left leaning. I don't think that's entirely fair. I've spent too much time reading leftists on Twitter to ever call the Brookings Institution left. But it's sort of the liberal establishment, the organization that's serious and cares about stuff, and Democrats donate to or whatnot. The Brookings Institution did a write-up on the Caesar Act. It's just outrageous. I mean, it's just bloodthirsty garbage. So yeah, this is not just a Trump problem. This is an everybody problem. The sad thing about this is that the United States has always had the capability. I just saw Tony Gohagan. Thank you so much for that super chat. I will remember Tony Gohagan. If you have any questions, I will make a point to answer those in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Also, ANS 3300. I will do the same. Thank you so much for that super chat. Where the hell were we? Okay, so yes, the tragedy of this and the tragedy of the sanctions policy is that the United States has such incredible power in the world. If the U.S. was just like, we give up, you got it, okay, cool. The Syrian problem could be resolved for the Middle East in a year or two. I proposed this. I think it's a 2-year-old video at this point, if not a 3-year-old video, where I was like, okay, the Syrian war is over. How do we settle this? And how we settle this is really straightforward. The U.S. Basically agrees to rebuild Syria under Assad. Obviously, there could never be U.S. troops or probably even U.S. organizations doing it, considering how thoroughly USAID and the State Department have tainted themselves by supporting Al-Qaeda for the past number of years. But U.S. money would be used to rebuild Syria in return for Syria's acceptance of refugees back. That's the deal. That's what makes sense. There are plenty. I'm not saying that people who don't want to go back to Syria should be forced to go back. Absolutely not. But right now, a lot of those, I guess, it's 6? Is it 5 or 6 million Syrian refugees? That's more than a quarter of Syria's pre-war population are scattered. Either in Turkey, they're in Lebanon, they're all over the world. They're afraid to go back. I would argue a majority, or at least millions of them, would love to go back tomorrow, but they won't go back because they're afraid of Assad. This fantasy that we're going to be able to use these brutal sanctions to get Assad to go away is horseshit. What the appropriate response has been for 2 or 3 years, I've talked about it before, is for U.S. money to be dedicated to rebuilding Syria in return for Assad's verifiable, documented acceptance of refugees and agreement to not persecute returned refugees. That is the deal. That's how Syria finally begins to recover. That's how the 20 million, 21 million Syrians finally begin to be able to rebuild their lives. If Assad gets to continue to be in Damascus, who fucking cares? The infantile nature of this. We don't like Assad, so we're going to murder 500,000 people. It's childish. That's what the United States did. It's not. It's fundamentally unserious and fundamentally unworthy of this century. This approach to Assad. What we should be focused on is rebuilding this country, rebuilding the lives of the people who live there, and that is that this Caesar Act horseshit is a continuation of the policy that murdered 500,000 Syrians, and it's a placekeeper so we can go back and murder 500,000 more at some point in the future, and it enrages me. I think I've covered that. The reason, and the thing is, as much as I hate the Caesar Act, you can see why those malicious little fucks in Washington D.C. are doing this right now, because Syria right now is falling into a perfect storm of shit. Syria had been destroyed, and now it's gotten to a point where the conflicts that will be necessary to restore Syria will be infinitely more costly. Turkey has now almost entirely moved into that Al-Qaeda pocket. In the short term, that's good. I think it's good that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, basically the third rebranding of Al-Qaeda in Syria, no longer has the power to just heighten the conflict willy-nilly all the time. And it's conceivable that with Turkey in more firm control of the Idlib pocket, there will be a real cease to conflict. However, it's not like Turkey, Syria. It's not like Syria is ever going to be cool with the fact that Turkey is now occupying a lot of northern Syria. So the eventual conflict with Turkey and Syria will be even more damaging. But that's something that I think is probably on pause for a year or so as everybody tries to deal with this coronavirus nightmare. So you've got a Syria that was destroyed. And then you've got COVID, which is very difficult for any country to deal with, especially difficult for a poor country to deal with, even more difficult for a poor country that is not in consistent control of all of its territory and capable of putting in public health measures. Now, the Syrian government does control most of the population centers of the country. The sort of northern Turkish and Al-Qaeda, the Turkish pocket across most of the top of the country, the Kurdish pocket. I mean, a lot of that is desert. And the main population center in northern Syria, Aleppo, was taken back by the Syrian government, I think, back in 2016. The problem, of course, this is something that Western media loves to emphasize, but is very true, is that Assad's control of the government-controlled areas is inconsistent. There are militias that control stuff. There are different power brokers. I think warlord is a loaded term, but is one that is, one you could conceivably use. So Syria is facing COVID without the ability to do a concerted public health response. So yeah, it's nightmare times. And there's the oil crisis. Yes, Trump has stolen, and the Kurds prior to, and Trump have stolen Syria's already meager oil resources from the majority of the Syrian people. But, I think there was still some, maybe I'm thinking of Iraq rather than Syria, but I think there was still some revenue coming to the Syrian regime through oil stuff. That's gone. That's another problem. And now probably the worst is the Lebanon crisis, which is something I should probably do a video on, but God, Lebanon is just, it's what, like fucking 5 to 7 million people with the most complicated history on the goddamn planet. Honestly, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, that just complicated. However, Lebanon is going through a crisis where I think what we're seeing in Lebanon right now is sort of the end of Lebanon's banking privilege. Lebanon had this weird thing. It had history as sort of the Paris of the Middle East or what have you, or is it the Paris of the Mediterranean? there was always a lot of trading wealth in Lebanon, going back to Ottoman times. Lebanese Christians were better at working their way into European trading networks. It was always kind of a wealthy place, and they have a tremendous diaspora that includes some of the richest people in the world. Carlos Slim, I think the richest man in Mexico for years and years and years, he may have been displaced, was of Lebanese descent. Very rich Lebanese or just prosperous Lebanese classes throughout the Middle East, throughout the United States. And a lot of them were happy to continue to park their money in Lebanon. And a lot of Gulf money was in Lebanon. I listened to a fascinating podcast on this number of months back. I think it was on Radio Warner. But essentially, it's sort of had a whole ton of money and whatnot available, and was borrowing a lot in dollars to sort of keep things spinning, and things have stopped spinning in Lebanon. And that's a real problem because obviously Syria, the poor country right next door to Lebanon, was pretty invested in Lebanon, pretty tied up with what's happening there. And to see Lebanon, which obviously still had large poverty problems and whatnot, but Lebanon that had a serious first world-ish banking system and financial resources, having that all explode is another disaster for Syria. So the Syrian economy is falling to pieces. And this sort of throwing on the secondary sanctions on top, the Caesar Act, I think, is an attempt by the U.S. government to be like, ooh, he looks super shaky. Let's see if we can push him over. My hunch is that he will not be pushed over, and that things will just get worse and worse and worse for the Syrian people. But it's crucial to think, and nobody in Washington, D.C. ever does think this through. So what happens if it works? If everybody in Damascus marches on the palace, and either Assad and his family flees to Moscow, or they get Gaddafi'd in the streets of Damascus. What happens next? What happens next is all these fucked up warlords, take over stuff. The Al Qaeda folks up top, the generally jihadist. I think there is Al Qaeda in the Idlib pocket that Turkey may or may not be working to stamp out right now. But all of the sort of Turkish-sponsored forces are strongly jihadist. So Assad falls. The country falls into these weird little government-oriented fiefs under warlords, and then the Turkish-sponsored jihadists come rolling down through Aleppo and down to Damascus. This is going to be good. There's another 5 to 10 million refugees that go spilling into Europe. How is this? What's the fucking goal here? The goal should be to rebuild the country, not to destroy it even further. But of course, that's what the secondary sanctions are here to do: destroy Syria even further, in the hopes that they can get rid of Assad, after which there is no plan. There is no plan at all. It's just evil and stupid and really quite heartbreaking. I guess I should do more videos on Syria, but then I should do more videos on Syria. I should do more videos on Yemen. There's a lot of things I should do more videos on. But I did want to address that. I'm sort of in between apartments, houses, what have you. So this week I think I'm just going live in the hopes that I can bank up a few videos to keep up hitting my deadlines over the next month or so. So I think that is everything I wanted to talk about with the Syria Caesar sanctions. Did that make sense? Let me know and start asking questions. I'll deal with anything. There was another Typical Tyrant has a comment and a super chat. Thank you, Typical Tyrant, and your $9.99 super chat. Assad is a third-rate dictator who got caught in between something much larger than him, and he wasn't able to deal with it. And the heavy foreign intervention will scar the region forever. I think that's very true. I think that, yeah, I mean, Assad was a tin pot dictator. And there's a video I did in that Syria playlist that's called "Why Regime Change is Always a Mistake." And when I was born in 1979, the world was filled with tin pot dictators. The Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Latin America, all the Asian tigers, all those, South Korea, Taiwan, um, certainly Indonesia. God, I'm so sorry, Loga. I can't call to mind what Malaysia's experience was. But yeah, I mean, there were dictators everywhere, and we know how to deal with dictators. We deal with dictators by helping their countries get richer, so the dictators get richer, and then the people in the country are like, "Wait, we're richer, we have leisure time and capacity now, and we don't want a dictator anymore." That worked fucking everywhere. That worked across Asia. That worked across Eastern Europe. That worked across Latin America. But no, instead we want to create wars so we can sell bombs. So yeah, Assad was caught in between something much larger than him. And the really horrifying thing is that Bashar Assad came to power in, I want to say 2000, 2004, thereabouts, somewhere in there. The direct successor of his father. And Bashar, I think they called the Damascus Spring, where it was like, oh, everything's going to be great, and then he clamped down. And it's like, no, 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 no. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But I think Bashar did have the willingness to move beyond the all-fired brutality of his father, and create a richer place because he'd get richer. That eventually had more. A more pluralistic system. And in 2010, like there was the sort of free trade area, and I think even free movement of people area with Turkey, between Turkey, Lebanon, Syria. Like banks were coming in, Western banks were coming in. Like Syria was opening up. Like it was doing exactly the process that, had nothing else happened, probably would have had like a legitimate, successful, move towards democracy in Syria by now. Instead, we've had 10 years of extraordinary destruction that, as typical tyrant says, exactly, it will scar the region forever. And it's just such an extraordinary waste. Anyway, sure, maybe I'm just angrier now because I'm functionally homeless. This is an angrier video than I normally like to do. And also, Syria makes me angry, and it should make you angry. It's stupid. Anyway, thanks so much. Alter Auditor asks, is there a realistic way? There's another super chat. Thank you, Alter Auditore. Or is it Alter Auditore? Is there a realistic way for the U.S. and the international community to guarantee any kind of democratic transition with Assad part of that transition? No, I don't think there is. I think Syria will have a democratic transition in my lifetime. And the US and the international community, which, it's interesting, like there are real disputes between the US and the international community, but these are sort of like the kinds of disputes that in the 19th century that Britain would have with Canada or Britain would have with Australia. Like if we seriously impact European interests as we did with the Iran sanctions, then there's dramatic pushback. With Syria policy, I don't see any European pushback. So I don't think there is, I think in Syria, it's pretty much just what the US empire wants all the way. So I don't think there is a realistic way for the US and the international community, such as it is, to participate in a democratic transition with Assad, because we've just spent the past 10 years destroying the country. It's like asking Hitler to participate in a democratic transition for Poland. It's just obviously Hitler was worse. But, we did kill, that's I guess it's only 2.5% of the Syrian population has died since the U.S. started trying to help with, their democratic transition. Yeah, um, I think there is no realistic way for the U.S. to participate in a democratic transition in Syria because we murdered 500,000 people there. So no, sorry if that seemed a little glib, but those are my feelings. Louis Seifir asks, could you grant us an assurance that terrorists won't destroy the infrastructure America will build for them? Absolutely. We're the terrorists. We fund the terrorists, Louis Seifir. The terrorists that have destroyed things in Syria were applauded by the United States. The Idlib pocket that is all Al Qaeda, go back to 2015 and look at how the conquest of Idlib was reported in all US newspapers. We are the terrorists. We are Al Qaeda in Syria. Assad, the person I would like to be given money to rebuild his country in return for the acceptance of refugees, is an infinitely more effective anti-terror actor than anybody in the United States. That goes without saying. No, apparently it does not go without saying. It's something that needs to be said. Man, I need to take it down a notch. Thank you for the super chat, Louis Seifir. And yes, I think that perhaps this was a question provided to elicit exactly that reaction. As Louis Seifir, I think, well knows, the greatest funder of terrorism in Syria is the United States government. And I'm not talking about the imperialists, it's direct. We funded the rebellion. The rebellion is jihadists. It is even the New York Times has to admit that the main remaining rebel pocket in Syria is controlled by an Al Qaeda affiliate. So yeah, there we are. Thank you, Louis Seifir. Questions. Thank you for all the super chats, folks. That's great. I will now go to non-super chats questions. Questions. Farel asks, now that Haftar has effectively lost to the GNA, what do you think Haftar will do next? The really interesting Libya news this week, so Farel is talking about what's happening in Libya, was that Egypt supposedly was saying that it reserves the right to invade Libya, which seemed a little nuts to me, and also seemed a little ignorant of the capacity that Egypt has at this point, because Egypt, has a big military, but its activity in Libya is sort of heavily subsidized by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, countries that don't really, have a lot less discretionary cash than they used to. Haftar has lost in his attempt to take the west of Libya. That offensive, which was started just about a year ago, 14, 15 months ago, has been effectively crushed. That was the big news last month. He's lost. He's been booted out of all those areas. The really interesting question, and I don't know what's going to happen right now, is if that crushing of Haftar's goals and attempt there, if that crushing means that he will fall. I don't think it does. I think that he's obviously built up a serious power base there. He is still supported by France, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and Donald Trump sometimes, even though the U.S. government's official policy is supporting the UN-recognized government in the West. Haftar's got a lot of international support. The sort of story, and I think it's true, is that the reason that the UN-approved government was able to crush Haftar and boot him back over to the west of the country was because of Turkish support. Turkish military elements, not necessarily soldiers so much, but drones and whatnot, and also a whole bunch of their Syrian jihadist militias transplanted from northern Syria to Egypt. But I think what people are overestimating is the idea that, okay, well, they took all that stuff back, now they can roll across the country. I think people are even though I have videos pointing out why Turkey and Russia will never be, in alliance or serious allies. There's absolutely some negotiation going on between Turkey and Russia over what is okay, what can happen. We saw this in Syria. I think it was February when the Syrian government under Assad killed like 40 Turkish soldiers who were on Syrian territory, but like Putin was like, "Oh shit, like that's not cool," and Erdogan was like, "You fucking bet that's not cool." In response to that, the Turkish forces who are occupying a big slice of northern Syria just rolled across the Syrian army, just beat the shit out of them for a solid 3 days, took back half the territory, or I don't know, it wasn't exactly that, but a significant chunk of the territory that the Syrian government had taken 3 months to win away from Al Qaeda, like very quickly. And people were like, all the Washington, D.C. warmongers were like, OMG, Assad's going to fall now because, look, Erdogan's pissed off and he's rolling through. And in Libya, it's, you apply the force of a real military, and Turkey has a real military, to these sort of pissant rebel barrel bomb conflicts. And yes, you have extraordinary effects very quickly. That's what's happened in Libya this month. But what people are neglecting, and I think this is going to be the centerpiece of the Libya video that I really should put out, is the extent to which these things are not the product of forces on the ground. They are the product of negotiation. In Syria, when 40 Turkish soldiers died, Putin had to acknowledge, like, oh, okay, Turkey has to do a show of force now. Turkey gets to take a whole bunch of territory now, but it was within limits. It's not like Turkey could take back all that territory and then just go take Aleppo, because Russia wouldn't be okay with that. And I think that's the same thing we've got in Libya right now. Now that Haftar has been booted out of all the places he's been invading, I think at that point Russia says to Turkey, and I don't think it's something that they say. I think this is something that has already been negotiated. Says, okay, now Sirte, there's this poor town in the middle of Libya called Sirte, Sirte, that has been gone. I mean, I think it was the Islamic State controlled it for a bit. It's like the perfect border town between the GNA, the Government of National Accord, UN-supported government-affiliated militias on one side, and then Haftar and the east. And then Sirte is sort of the place in the middle. It's been taken, I think, at least 3 or 4 times since 2011 now, and that's now the front line. So I think that most probably Putin has said, okay, sure, you can let the GNA and the GNA and the LNA, the Libyan National Army, so-called Haftar's forces, let them fight over Sirte, but Turkish drones and jihadist forces aren't going to be, rampaging through the east, because Russia would not like that. That's my take on what's going to happen in Libya right now. I think even Russia is like, okay, let's have some kind of negotiation now. I think the reason that Haftar was crushed, one of the reasons that Haftar was crushed here, was because he pissed off his Russian and Egyptian and UAE masters by blowing off a lot of peace talks. So I think some kind of peace process is possible in Libya now. I mean, don't expect it to go super well, but it's better than them invading each other. And it's certainly better than the idea of Haftar taking over the whole country, because Haftar's kind of a piece of shit. Anyway, Will F asks, what do you think of the USA becoming non-interventionist by 2028? I don't believe in it for a second. The United States is a tremendously powerful country, will remain a tremendously powerful country. Could the United States become a less interventionist country by 2028? Absolutely. And I think that's something this channel works for. I do believe that with more sensible people in power, the United States can become less of a malicious nightmare state, can become less of a rogue state. I think that actually U.S. power does a lot of good things in the world. Speaking more in terms of soft power, I think that we're under the pressure of more and more legitimate competition with China. I think people are gonna wake up and realize that actually it's important, like part of the story of the U.S. abandoning any pretense of sovereignty or other people's opinions mattering is that from the 90s until 2008 or so, and to a large degree still today, but fading quickly, the U.S. could do whatever the fuck it wanted to. It was powerful enough that it could just steamroll everything. And I think that when serious people, unlike Trump and the Republicans, when serious people start looking at what a real competition with China will look like, I'm not actually too worried about China in the short term. I think that the Chinese Communist Party is kind of a joke as far as like really competing on the world stage. It's an open question whether they can, who knows? Like Taiwan is something that looks a little shaky right now, but the idea of like China is a real competitor to the United States in like say Latin America or even Africa right now doesn't pass the sniff test to me. However, I do believe that the story of the 21st century will be competition between China and the United States. And I think by 2028, almost a decade from now, I think that people in power in the United States will begin to realize how much damage we have done to our prospects for international competition by all this horseshit in Syria and Iraq and Venezuela, and we'll start working a little bit harder to actually look like a positive force in the world again. So then, yes, I mean, we're still going to be, unfortunately, I mean, it's still going to be, hard power and, occasional interventions are going to remain a facet, though hopefully much, much more occasional or less occasional interventions, but it'll still be a factor in the world, unfortunately. But like we can be dramatically less interventions and a lot more healthy. That is a possibility. So yeah, it's a very good question though. Tony Gohagan, thank you. You're super generous. Do you have a question? Okay. Let's see. Tony Gohagan, what is the roadmap to combating and changing U.S. foreign policy? BLM looks like it may change things, but they need lack of roadmap. No? What do we demand as far as what must change? The first thing is Yemen. I think I've been intending to push out some Yemen videos for about a month now, and that's hopefully what I'll be doing in the next week or so. But yeah, man, I mean, you want to talk about white supremacy? How about the way that we treat Yemen, the way that we treat Syria? That's white supremacy. God, the way we treat Somalia. I mean, that is white supremacy defined. That is, that's what we do. The idea that it just doesn't matter that U.S. bombs have been dropping on school buses in Yemen for the past 5 years. And yeah, I think I'm workshopping a video right now called Yemeni Lives Matter. And I think that's a fascinating thing that Tony's pointing to, that the idea that this Black Lives Matter thing, which is really extraordinary. Like, hey, let's talk about something I'm happy about, man. Like, Black Lives Matter. I made a video years ago talking about how Black Lives Matter is winning, and there's so much more work to do for police reform, for a number of things, even getting into sort of more namby-pamby social justice stuff. So much more work to do. But what's extraordinary is just seeing how Black Lives Matter has won. Like, it is, I mean, it is mind-blowing. They've got the polls that sort of had Black Lives Matter approval going from like low 30% to like 55%. That's a really crucial tipping point, because if something is approved by 55% of the U.S. public, like that's like, I mean, no politician is going to say anything bad about it. That's how marijuana legalization happened. Like, after being in the slowly moving up, marijuana legalization crossed 50%, and then boom, no politician in the world in the U.S. wants to say a thing negative about it. God, just 3 months ago, like Black Lives Matter was like as much of a hate object for Fox News and conservative commentators as Antifa is, and now, nope, it's gone. Like you've got like old school conservative commentators like just like looking like it's um, it's something they've always been for. Of course, Black Lives Matter. There was a really fascinating thing last week where like Mike Pence hadn't gotten the memo, and some journalist presses him on, do Black Lives Matter? Whatever. He goes, no, all lives matter, which was like the standard conservative response, like 2 months ago and for 5 years before that. And he was pilloried. Like I was hanging out with um, an uncle who's he's very much I don't think he's actually voted for Republican in a while, but he's very much a like pro business, old white guy, likes the military, and he's a veteran, like would have been a Republican if Republicans were sane the past decade or so. But it was fascinating because like, what the fuck is wrong with Mike Pence not saying Black Lives Matter? And like, I think my uncle was probably woke enough to be on board like, a year ago, but like 5 years ago, like he'd have been the guy saying all lives matter. And it's incredible, like how much that has shifted. And there's so much more work to do, of course. But man, it is awesome to see that. And yeah, I think it would be fantastic if we could connect that to some of our foreign policy stuff, because, well, I don't want to detract from the good work that needs to be done in the United States, but the wins that you could have by sort of applying some of this white supremacy analysis to our foreign policy are just immediate. Like Yemen is a war, has always been a war, where the United States just has to say stop, and it stops. Poof. Like, boom, that's it. If you had a fraction as many people marching to stop the war in Yemen, it'd be over. It'd like that. So I don't know. That'd be I'd certainly be some low hanging fruit there. It'd be worth heading for. Altair Auditory asks a fantastic question. Which countries are serious candidates to be the next hegemon? And the thing is, I don't see it. I don't see a new hegemon emerging. I see, people. This is a commonplace. People talk about it a lot. A multipolar world, a legitimately multipolar world. I really like the idea of. This is something that makes a lot of people nervous when you mention about it. Like some form of the best way for the United States to preserve its power is to continue to invest, because that's a lot of what we see in terms of world government is just the investment of U.S. power in creating these institutions, is for the U.S. to invest its remaining time on top in continuing to create stronger world government, for lack of a better term. It's to the benefit of the United States because we formulated a lot of these institutions, and getting to a point where other countries are similarly invested. That's where we should get. And because the alternative is not a hegemon, that's a problem. What's interesting about I wrote a book called Avoiding the British Empire, which you should all read, available on Amazon, both in paperback and for your Kindle. And it talks a lot about how actually the run up to World War I wasn't really like legitimate competition between a bunch of different European powers. It was a British system that was falling apart. And we're not going to see a new hegemon. We're going to see, if the US does this as poorly as it has been doing it, we're going to see the US hegemony continue to fall apart. And then a bunch of actors, China, India, Turkey, probably there'll be serious contenders on the African continent, maybe Brazil and Latin America, attempting to sort of all assert themselves. And that's how you get into a really grim sort of World War situation. So I don't think that's the thing. And unlike with World War I, World War II, it was like we don't have the option that we had with World War I and World War II. And in World War I and World War II together can really be seen as what happened when the British lost its grip. And then the answer was, well, okay, let's give it to the United States. And yes, there was a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, but that was more of a like last gasp against U.S. hegemony. The more I look at it, than it was a real competition between peer powers. Um, and I don't think we're going to get to a point where like there's a real option. If we fall into another chaotic war period, well, we could extinguish human life on this planet. We have that capability now. Yeah, I don't see China having the interest, the wherewithal, or the capacity to step in to the U.S. U.S.'s shoes, the way the U.S. stepped into the British shoes. And I've got a couple of videos talking about that. So yeah, that's a really great question. And unfortunately, I think it'd almost be better if there was a serious candidate to be the next hegemon. I think one of the virtues of like the U.S. and British period of power over the past 200 years is that it did build enough capacity, inadvertently, I mean, as a side effect, built enough capacity in the rest of the world where you could seriously talk about everybody sort of running things themselves under a more overarching framework. And if that overarching framework can be something that everyone's on board with, sort of like a United Nations with a little more buy-in, I think that's a much better result. That would be much better. All right. Mustafa Hamad, did I miss it? Was there a... Wow, you guys are super, super generous. Oh, man. Thanks for all these super chats. These are great. Thank you, David Garcia, for those $2. Brando Commando asked the questions. In your opinion, what would the U.S. do in a situation where Egypt annexes East Libya if there's a split government in Libya? The two allies the U.S. always sides with are Israel and Turkey, yet Haftar is a CIA asset and Egypt is a Russia ally. If Egypt annexed, I don't think the United States would do anything. I don't think we care. I think if there's one thing that U.S. policy has demonstrated, I think, maybe the UN Security Council would be like, don't do that. Don't do that. But if Egypt were to annex East Libya, they'd be doing so in the interests of, Haftar and sort of Russia. I mean, all that France and Russia really care about in Libya is, I think Russia mostly just wants to look like a big dick, but all that France really cares about is access to oil resources. So if Libya splits up, I don't think anybody's really going to care so much. Egypt has so many problems. Though, I mean, who knows? Maybe Egypt would be dumb enough to think that taking Libya's oil resources would solve some of their problems, but I don't think that would be the case. That's a really interesting thing to think about. I haven't thought about it much. But at this point, I don't think the United States would do much. I mean, Egypt is a pretty loyal satellite of the United States at this point. So yeah, I think it would be very bad. It would be another example. I mean, look, like it's fascinating that the United States got involved in the Middle East heavily, like physically. We were always sort of involved prior to, but like got seriously physically involved to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait because he violated somebody's sovereignty and invaded another country. For the past 6 years, we've been perfectly fine and very supportive of Saudi Arabia's attempt to do the exact same thing in Yemen. And it wouldn't even really be that much of a, so we've broken down, like, we're already supporting the kind of action that we got in the Middle East to stop. So if another one of our client states decided to do it, who knows? Maybe, I mean, with Trump, I'm sure we'd support it. With Biden, maybe we'd still support it. We'd say that's bad and do nothing about it. So yeah, it's just clear. Like, I think one of the horrors of Libya is that it's become so much less important in the current oil and gas picture. It's just not. It just doesn't matter. Their 1.5 million barrels of oil was a serious issue back when we had a tight oil market. Now it's, if it falls off the market, everybody in Texas gets excited. So yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, maybe I should take the potential Egyptian. Actually, that's a really good angle actually, on Libya. Thank you, Brando Commando. Okay, man, I have so many super chats to go through. It's amazing. Clorox Bleach, thank you. And David Garcia, if you guys have questions, I'll look out for those. Garcia, Clorox Bleach. Brando Commando, amazing. Thank you for extraordinary generosity. Mustafa Hamade, just wanted to say thank you for what you do. Well, thank you, Mustafa Hamade. That's very generous. I appreciate it. I will look out for questions you might have. Hamade. All right. Clorox Bleach. John Bolton literally said that the U.S. should just throw the Federalist Papers at countries after waging regime change wars and leave. Yeah, that's pretty fucking amazing. That was kind of interesting. Like, yeah. One thing that we should have done with Iraq after Kuwait is we should have beaten them, said, don't ever do that again, and then started buying oil from them again. I think that would have been the best thing to do. And because, as certainly the story of my life has indicated, you defeat dictators by buying them out. Happen all over the place. You guarantee the continue of ruinous suffering for a country if you decide to invade or do some other kind of regime change or shit. All right. Let's see. Maltemeyer asks, why do you think that higher German militarization would lead to a European arms race? Would go against basically everything other EU countries demand from Germany. Why do I think that a higher German militarization would lead to a European arms race? Because Germany has sort of a terrifying history. That's sort of something that, I mean, certainly as recently as German reunification in 1990 and the sort of post-Cold War thing, not just in Russia, but in Russia and Britain and France, because the countries back in 1990 were still all run by people with serious living memories of World War II. There's a tremendous amount of fear around Germany. And I feel like as national, even though that living memory of World War II is quickly fading, World War I and II is quickly fading away, I think that as countries get more hyper-nationalist, get more, just not hyper-nationalist, just get more nationalists in Europe, which we've already seen, and I think is sort of a very likely result to sort of less U.S. presence in Europe. Not that, I mean, I am for less U.S. presence in Europe, but I think that memory, that historical memory with Germany will crop up more because, I mean, realistically, a lot of people are super panicked about the threat from Russia, and a lot of that is U.S. Motivated, but a lot of that is sort of European legacy thinking and just serious concerns that they have. But if we really are talking about a Europe without the United States present, people are going to start thinking a lot more seriously. Like, honestly, like Germany today, like with 6 months notice, I bet would be able to beat Russia in a stand-up war. Even though Germany is, nominally disarmed, pacifist, whatnot, like it's just a functional country to an extent that Russia is not. I mean, Russia, with all of its vaunted, this, that, and the other thing, 6 years later, all its asymmetrical warfare and everything, like it hasn't taken much of Ukraine back, has it? Russia's military budget is a tiny fraction of the military budgets of all the European countries combined. And of course, that's a ridiculously silly comparison because cost of goods are higher in Europe. There's no coordination between all these forces in Europe. But even now, with Germany's largely demilitarized thing, I think with 6 months preparation, they could beat Russian forces in Germany or Eastern Europe, for sure. And with 5 years preparation, they could, you could never invade Russia. But they would outright win a war with Russia anywhere other than the environ of the Urals. So yeah, I think that the German, even though the Germans are sort of so consciously pacifist, and I applaud that, I think that nobody serious can deny that German capacity is just huge, and always, I mean, not always will be, but will be for the rest of my life, and presumably for centuries to come. The 80 million Germans versus, what, 40 million Poles, like 10, 12 million Hungarians or something like that. And yeah, so I don't know if that answered your question, Malta, but I don't know. And I mean, like, I believe in the German commitment to sort of pacifism and renouncing older approaches to things, but um, I don't think you can rely on the rest of Europe to believe that. So. Questions. Fabian Salatkovich says, "What do you think about how things are going in Poland and Hungary?" I've not been paying enough attention to how things are going in Poland and Hungary. I think that my general position on sort of Poland and Hungary are turning back into fascists, I think that's really overblown. I think that democracy doesn't always do what you want it to do. I think there are aspects to the Orban and is it peace governments in Hungary and Poland that are problematic, just like there are elements to what Barack Obama did that were problematic. And yeah, I think that functionally, I mean, we're rounding what, the second or third decade of largely credible democracy, like third or fourth decade of largely credible democracy in Poland and Hungary. So yeah, I mean, they're gonna go in different directions. I think actually the fact that some of the ways that government is evolving in Hungary and Poland, the fact that that's sort of appalling to their Western European paymasters is good. I think it's sort of a sign of independence. Does that mean that everything that I think Orban specifically, who's a little further along than the peace are, does that mean everything that they do is good? No. Does that mean that like nothing they do is at all troubling? No. But I'm not quite as like every time Orban or the peace people want to change the constitution. I think it's part of national independence and a real functional democracy that some of these decisions be made for themselves. Yeah. Would I run a government the way that Orban runs a government or peace? Probably not. But I'm not Hungarian or Polish. And yeah, I mean, I think that certain things should not be done. They should not be doing certain things. But until Poland and Hungary start invading their neighbors, that's something I actually worry about. And with Hungary, I'm not going to be too angry, or like start putting people in camps or like stealing elections or whatever. Like, I'm not going to get too exercised about it. But unfortunately, no, I have not been making a study of. I mean, I saw something about Orban like taking emergency powers because of the coronavirus, and then somebody else might have said they put it back. But like at this point, we're talking about tweets I've read rather than actual analysis. So I'm not going to dive into that. RF Hor, that's a really good point that I should have covered here. What do you think of the effects of the Caesar Act on Lebanon, its politics and economy? That's really shitty. And it's so Lebanon is going through this disaster with the sort of implosion of its banking system, whole population falling into poverty, basic services not being able to be provided, and all of this stuff. And Lebanon, the Caesar Act is going to be disastrous because, yes, as I pointed out, these are secondary sanctions. Lebanon is the neighboring country to Syria because of history that that Syria, I think, occupied Lebanon for maybe 20 years. So between like 1990 and 2004, am I right about that? As a outgrowth of the Lebanese civil war, the Syrian government occupied Lebanon. for a period of time up until the Cedar Revolution, and I want to say 2004, 2005. So there's just tremendous interweaving between these two countries. So all of a sudden, the fact that you've got this banking system that's already falling, business people that are already in tizzy running out to get their money out, and now one of their main lines of business and interaction or just diplomatic interaction has now been criminalized in a way. It's disastrous for Lebanon. That's another aspect of this that I should have pointed to. So yeah, tremendously frustrating. So yeah, RF4 is absolutely right. The effects of the Caesar Act on Lebanon and its politics and economy will be disastrous. So there you go. Brandon Commando, are you optimistic or pessimistic on the current issues in the U.S.? Is the U.S. too big to fail, or could it collapse within a year? I would definitely lean more towards the U.S. is too big to fail. I'm not sure exactly what you'd mean by collapse. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people think that there'll be some kind of disaster in the election, some kind of, delegitimization. I think at this point, it looks like Trump has dug himself so large a hole that, if, every million black people has one voting booth, that's referring to voter suppression stuff, he'll still lose. So, yeah, it is very interesting just how there's so much in the United States that is just sort of rickety. And, after 40 years of sort of like, fuck government, government sucks, government's the worst, we've created a kind of shitty government that isn't capable of things. And I think there's a lot of concern around voting that I'm not currently as worried about, because I just think that Trump's going to be blown out of the water. But if things close a little more, if Trump is not blown out of the water, then we could have another 2000 situation where it takes a month to figure out who became president. And I think, unlike 2000, when we were sort of riding high and nobody had complaints that were that big, I think that could get pretty dark. Yeah, but as far as collapse, I think that's oversold. I think the U.S. hasn't been asked to do much for the past 70 years. Hasn't been asked to do much other than get rich and sit around and be prosperous. And for the past 20 years, we've been failing to do even that. If you're not a baby boomer with an investment portfolio that was already large 20 years ago, now it's much larger. But generally, I think the U.S. has been fucking up and has not been delivering on its promises to the world, to itself, to its citizens. But I don't think I think we've got enough still in our favor. It's been tremendously touching just how much people care worldwide about this Black Lives Matter thing. It's just like people still hold us to a higher standard, which is fantastic. Because I'm getting less and less, becoming less and less of a believer in American exceptionalism. But yeah, I think we are at a point where we need to do a lot of things better. I think we are capable of doing a lot of things better. So I don't think collapses. So I think I'm optimistic. The coronavirus thing, it continues to be a tremendous source of pessimism. For a long time, you could say, I was saying, God, like Trump has fucked this up so extraordinarily. Like we are the worst with this. And, people could be like, well, actually, if you look at the per capita numbers, all those European countries you love, Rob, they did just as poorly. Actually, Spain and Italy and Germany, they all did worse. But that's no longer true because all those European countries were able to crush the curve. And U.S. just sort of plateaus. So yeah, I think we're already at the largest per capita case count, and if things continue on the current trajectory, we'll be at the largest per capita death count. Even though we're sort of figuring out better ways to treat coronavirus, people are going to keep dying. So yeah, it's getting to the point where on every measure, the United States is the worst at handling the coronavirus, and I gotta hope that's going to prompt some change. But the George Floyd thing and the sort of taking to the streets, that just makes me pretty uniformly optimistic. It's fantastic. U.S. policing I mean, to some extent, this channel started talking about U.S. policing, and to be at a point where it's like, holy shit, like real reforms are happening, like they're being enacted, like now. Um, that's great, and of course, the momentum could fall off. Never underestimate our ability to be complacent, but no, I am optimistic. Yeah. I'm optimistic about the United States right now. It could all go to shit, It's 2020. Who knows? But I am optimistic. All right. Questions. Chlorix Bleach asks, do you think a regime change war went like what the U.S. did with Japan post World War II, that regime change would be more effective? Is it just less effort and tension from the U.S. nowadays for real change? No, what it is, so people keep pointing to Germany and Japan as effective regime change things, but you got to understand, like, two things about Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan were completely, their ideology was crushed. When somebody showed up there wasn't like if the United States tries to crush an Iraq or a Venezuela, it's just a straightforward invasion. There was no threat. There was no, Venezuela was never going to fucking invade Texas. Iraq was never going to invade Hawaii. Like, it's just an invasion. Like, what happened with Japan and Germany, to differing extents, but these were wars that they started. These were wars that their publics knew they started. Like, there was no, like, like Pearl Harbor isn't something where, like, oh, you were mean to your Kurds, or you did some gassing that one time, or, we think you have nukes, or no, it was like Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. It started a war with us that they lost miserably. Germany, and yeah, of course, yeah, we embargoed their oil. That's a whole nother conversation I want to get into. Germany, like, chose a guy and existed under a guy who actively looked for war for 5 years and then finally got it. Like, the Germans were under an ideology of conquest and they knew it. The Japanese were under an ideology of conquest and they knew it. And they suffered an extraordinary amount for an ideology of conquest that they largely chose. I mean, both Japan and Germany had democratic systems that they discarded voluntarily in favor of these ideologies of conquest. These wars that they lost with their occupation and subjugation started with them occupying and subjugating other people. They didn't have why are these fucking people coming to get us? They knew why these people were coming to get them. And they also had, this is crucial. So, like, that's a really important element. Like, the motivating ideology of these countries was conquest and war, and they lost war. That part of them was sort of crushed. And I think as somewhat homogenous and created homogeneity, places with deep pride, they were interested in doing whatever they could to sort of reestablish themselves, and they acknowledged that the war making path was a complete failure. Those are very unique psychological things. That's one aspect. And even even with all of that I just talked about, if that was the only thing that was going on psychologically, I almost guarantee that the U.S. occupations of those places would fail. There was not the only factor. Both the German ideology prior to World War II and the Japanese ideology prior to World War II, this is something that I've only come to appreciate recently. It's very obvious with the Nazis. But Nazi ideology and Japanese conservative militarist ideology, I don't know what the appropriate word is for it, were so geared to be anti-Soviet. They were all about being anti-Soviet. They were all about being terrified of the Soviet Union. That's what they were becoming an empire to do, was to fight the Soviet Union. Like, we know, like, everybody knows that was a huge part of Nazi ideology. But that was a huge part for the Japanese militarists as well. So, like, you've got this whole, like, populace in both Germany and Japan that are primed to be like, we had to do all this conquest stuff to fight against the Soviets. And now we've been completely destroyed, but thank God we're occupied by these Americans who are at least better than the Soviet monster we've been taught about our entire lives. So those are the aspects, those unique aspects to the German and Japanese occupations that are simply just not going to be the case, like ever, with any new occupation. And it's also worth fucking remembering that, like, I think we had set up, like, I'm not sure, we had set up Japanese and West German governments by like the early 50s. Like, yes, actually, by some measures, we are still occupying Germany and Japan with military forces, military basing, but but the governments are independent, and we're independent of us very quickly, like 5 years, like 5 to 7 years. Like with the Japanese Constitution was 1950, I think. It's been a long time since I studied that. Yeah, so like a 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, no, nobody's going to fucking do that right. We've done it as well as is possible to be done, because we're so all-fired wealthy and we've dumped $1 trillion fucking dollars into it. But no, I'd like the German and Japanese, the U.S. occupations of Germany and Japan were ones where, for a variety of reasons, like very highly educated, motivated, capable people were in an alliance with the occupiers almost instantly to figure out how to get back on their feet. That is not going to be the case fucking anywhere else in the world, especially because we're the aggressor. Germany and Japan, slightly arguable in the Japanese case, but not really. We're the aggressors in these conflicts. So yeah, the idea that the U.S. can just go fucking invade places, it's a fantasy and it's wrong. Thank you, Clark Speech, for that great question. Okay. Questions. I see we're getting into the history of Islam. That's somewhere I don't really necessarily need to be. Where we got questions? We got questions. Have we got questions? Pirate King asks, do you think Morocco should let go of the Western Sahara? I mean, sure, but they're not going to do that. What I think should happen with the Western Sahara, I've done videos on this, is just for both Algeria and Morocco can maintain their positions and just back off, just like, sure, like keep funding Polisario, Algeria, sure, like Western Sahara, like Morocco, Western Sahara, it's yours, whatever. But like there are so many more important things in Moroccan-Algerian relations and like economic and like building of the power of North Africa than their like dispute over this section of desert. So like I would love it if Morocco just decided one day that Western Sahara wasn't important to them, but it's not going to happen at this point. So I think it's just for both the Moroccan and Algerian governments to just dial it down a notch. And accept that there's not going to be a resolution of Western Sahara and move on in bilateral relations without that. Open their border, continue to try to build a broader North African business space, and then who knows? Maybe 20, 30 years from now, it just won't matter. Oh, sorry. Okay, Logo Cool Extreme. Apparently, I've been avoiding his questions. Where we got? I can't neglect the moderator. Well, he's been asking the same question for 45 minutes now, but I don't know what it is. Okay, Logo Cool Extreme, where are you? No, we're talking about North Korean concerts. I don't know, Logo. I'm not seeing these questions you've been asking the whole time. Gallup G asks, what do you think about France being a G7 member supporting a coup attempt pointed at the UN-recognized Libya government? Yeah, that's a real good question, Gallup G. Like the Libya, the international community's treatment of Libya has just been, it's like it'd be funny if it weren't so awful. The thing about the Libyan conflict is it's not, because there's just nobody there. I mean, that's not true. There's like 5 or 6 million people in all of Libya. You could probably put, like, geographically, you could put like what 15 Syrias into Libya, but there's a quarter as many people there. Um, but like that doesn't matter. Like just because oil doesn't matter anymore, and Libya is a underpopulated place with a bunch of unsympathetic militias, like it is really offensive the way that the international community, like this is what it looks like in a world without a hegemon. The international community has just sort of decided to, oh, let's play war games. It's fun. Like, and you can read write-ups or like everyone's trying out their drone technology in Libya. It's like, isn't this like a funny, weird sci-fi war? And isn't it funny that people are, bolting anti-aircraft missiles to the back of their pickup trucks and firing them at each other? It's the stakes are very low in Libya, but it's really unfortunate what the international community has chosen to do with this low stakes conflict, because there are millions of people who live there. There is what looks like the rebirth of an African slave trade in Libya. It's really shitty, and yeah, this is what a world without a hegemon looks like. And yeah, France should be taken to task for supporting, as should the UAE, as should Egypt, as should Saudi Arabia, as should Russia, for supporting an actor that's acting against the UN-approved government, for sure. But that's not the world we live in, unfortunately. Okay, Logo, where's that question you've been asking? Where's the question? Still not seeing Logo Cool Extreme's question. Yeah. Clorox Bleach wants me to learn how to draw trees, which is a problem. Over my Instagram at the Golden Age, my poor sketching of things has become a thing. If you want to see me fail to draw trees, you can look at my Instagram at the Golden Age. Okay, questions. Oh God. Questions. Mm-hmm. I can't find your questions, Logo Cool Extreme. Oh, wait, where is it? No. We're calling out Tariq Al Sulbi. Where is the question, Logo? All right, well, Cyrus has a question. Okay, I'm going to ask Cyrus's question, then I'm going to ask Brando Commando's. Serious Great asks, when do you think democracy in the Arab world will be achievable? We've got it in Tunisia right now. Unfortunately, what you see in Tunisia is how much democratic government fails when all the countries around it are in trouble. There's one of the great, sad ironies of Tunisia is that when it was under a dictator, it was surrounded by prosperous petrostates, Algeria and Libya. Because back in 2011, when Tunisia was a dictatorship, and for the decades before it, oil price was consistently high. Well, not always, because there were dips in the 80s, I think. But for a while there, certainly in the 2 decades, because of China, certainly in the decade leading up to the last decade of the dictatorship in Tunisia, you had 2 very prosperous petrostates, Libya and Algeria, on either side of Tunisia. So there was a lot of money flowing over to Tunisia. It was a beloved vacation spot. Unfortunately, Libya, for the entire 9-year period where Tunisia has had a functioning democracy, Libya has been a mess. Instead of spare oil money, they've been sending refugees and jihadists. And Algeria is still unified and should, I hope, remain so. But they have dramatically less money because oil prices are lower now. So yeah, I think there already is Arab democracy, and what I would like to see is some prosperity return to the region, and that democracy spreads. I think there's a lot of hope for that possibility in Algeria, especially as the Algerian military dictatorship continues to fail to deal with low prices over the next couple of years. I think Morocco's already, made some moves in that direction. I think the Middle East, the Arab world will go democratic first in North Africa, and hopefully it'll spread to Egypt and then into the Middle East. But I mean, in Iraq and Syria, Iraq is nominally a democracy right now, but it's sort of a. I need to read more about Iraq, but I'm not super optimistic. So yeah, I think democracy in the Arab world has, been achieved. The problem is you can't get the benefits from that if, the region is burning down, and it can't spread if the region is burning down. So that's my question for Cyrus the Great. Brandon Commando asks, thoughts on the recent developments in North Korea. Kim Yo-jong seems to have a bigger role than before, and relations have deteriorated between North and South. I made a commitment. I think I did a live chat talking about it maybe a year or two ago, saying like why I'm not going to say anything about North Korea because I don't believe anything serious is going to change. Yes, the Kim Yo Jong thing. I think I read a profile of her that's interesting. Kim Jong Un's sister is supposedly taking. There was a period, I guess, a month or two back, where everyone was like, "Is Kim Jong Un dead?" He was apparently sick, and his sister sort of stepped forward. It's unpleasant just how medieval the relationships are. Is the next heir a good one? Are in North Korea, the extent to which it's family dynasty politics that matter in North Korea more than anything else is a real pity. But like it was clear to me from the get-go, from Trump's talking about threatening nuclear war, and then we're going to meet with Kim Jong Un. It was clear to me that nothing fundamental was going to change. And I continue to believe that nothing fundamental is going to change under the Trump administration. So with that conviction, I haven't been looking into North Korea as much, and sadly, I don't think I can really speak to it too much. Yeah, I'm afraid that's the case. Has Logo Cool Extreme got a question? No, apparently not. Farel asks, if the EU collapses, who will assert influence over them? I think it's. I think if the EU collapses, what you're probably going to get is an attempt to sort of restart it. I think there's going to be a Northern European Union, quite possibly, and then you're going to have a lot of countries that. Yeah, I think it'll be sort of a Northern European Union, and that'll be interesting because who knows? Maybe you can convince Hungary to join that because I think economically, I think they're not the worst, and that'll restrain their any revisionist hopes that they might have. But I think that I think if there's a new Northern European Union, will Italy be in it? Will Portugal be in it? Greece certainly fucking won't. And I think what that introduces is a dynamic where you've got a sort of wealthy, prosperous European Union, then you've got this sort of underbelly of Europe where Turkish influence, Russian influence can become more of Chinese influence can become much more of a dynamic. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think that kind of thinking might actually be a lot of what's keeping the EU going. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised, the fact that the EU still kind of exists. And I think we're having a conversation with Malta where he was making the case that the coronavirus crisis might actually help the EU last longer. It sort of helped Germany get over some of its loathing for what's the word? Of furthering the financial European project. I don't know, but if the EU collapses, yeah, I think there'll be some kind of Northern European alliance that looks very similar to what had happened before, and then a lot of Eastern and Southern European question mark that would be grim. And I think part of that question mark is old school sort of nationalist ideas resurfacing. So yeah, it's interesting stuff. Questions. Logan, did you have a question, or you're just sort of really just diving in on Tariq? Questions. Clark Spleesh asks, do you think Brazil will return to military dictatorship? That's an interesting question. I think my understanding is that that's almost, not quite, but almost an explicit goal of the Bolsonaro government. I think Bolsonaro's government has made a return to power for Lula much more likely, right? I mean, maybe that's just the reporting I see, but no. I mean, even I think in The Economist welcomed Bolsonaro coming to power. Was that just a year ago? Because, sure, he's a fascist, but he's right-leaning and he's going to reform pensions. And yeah, we love that shit at The Economist. And now they're like, oh my God, like Bolsonaro's a nightmare case. So while, yeah, I think Bolsonaro talks about the return of the military dictatorship, like that's something that might be positive, but I think he's really done a great job of demonstrating how shitty quasi-fascist government is. Let me qualify that. I do not study, like I read like an article or two about Brazil, and I think the longest articles I've read have been by leftists, so don't quote me on that. But I am less concerned after a year of the Bolsonaro government about the end of democracy in Brazil. Because, Bolsonaro, he's the military dictatorship guy, and he's just demonstrated just how piss poor, the right-wing types are at actually running government. It's possible you could argue that, well, just the level of chaos and dysfunction in Brazil is getting so high that a military government seems more likely, and I think that's possible. But I do think Bolsonaro's complete failure in government makes that seem less likely. Multimire says, don't forget that Italy is a net contributor to the EU budget, which is very interesting. I need to know more about Italy, for sure. Pandemonium Niebuhr says, you got a question from Destructive Blade earlier. So as I've demonstrated in my difficulty sort of finding Loga's question, it's hard for me to scroll through this and continue to talk. I think it'd be kind of boring for all of you to watch me go. So if Destructive Blade had a question, please ask it again. More Freedom Foundation, the Sunny 333 asks, More Freedom Foundation, do you think any country of North Africa or Middle East, including Iranic country, will collapse? The country that I'm most worried about right now, have been for a couple of years, is Egypt. Egypt's got 100 million people, can't feed itself. Its economy is in tatters. Who was it? There's an Egyptian commenter pointed out, like, a couple of weeks back, was like, Jesus Christ, 50 years ago, we were going toe to toe with the United States, France, Israel, and Britain. Now we're going toe to toe with Ethiopia. And, Ethiopia's a great country, powerful place, interesting, a lot of people, but it's like Egypt has sort of fallen pretty far in terms of its geopolitical weight and potential. It's a place that I worry about a lot. Like, what if there was something I was worried, like, what if something happens to food systems because of coronavirus? Like, Egypt just starts starving. It's a place that is run by a murderous dictator and not run particularly well. So yeah, I do worry about what could happen to Egypt. That's the one in North Africa I worry about the most. I mean, like, depends on what you mean by collapse. Like collapse, like civilizational collapse, like oh shit, like, tens of millions of refugees. Like Egypt's the one I worry about for that. Governmental collapse, I mean, I worry about all of them. I mean, Tunisia has a very delicate democracy that a new democracy that hasn't been able to deliver much for its people because of the way I mean, honestly, Europe has been in the doldrums for the entire length of Tunisia's democracy. So through no fault of its own, Tunisia's democracy hasn't been able to deliver much for its people. So it's that government could fall. Algeria's government, I believe, will fall in the next 5 years. They're going to see serious changes there because the already aging and illegitimate government of Algeria is, getting older, and the oil money isn't coming back. So that's going to be a real problem. Libya has failed. So yeah, Morocco. I have not done an in-depth study of Morocco. I've only read like one history book that covered Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya. But I do think Morocco is fairly stable. There's a lot of things that make me think that, but I don't have an in-depth opinion on that. But yeah, Egypt's the one that I like worry about for a collapse. But I don't have much faith in any of the governments in North Africa, other than limited and not too educated faith in Egypt. Myers has just wanted to say that with Italy, because a lot of North European countries like to forget about it, and international press is there not better. That's true. And James Cook even has a nasty nickname for Italy. And I don't, I think Malta has demonstrated that I don't know enough about Italy to speak to it right now. One of my favorite movies is called The Great Beauty by Paolo Sorrentino or Tini. I don't know. So I love that. As probably every couple months I sit down and look at Rome. But as far as I'm not. Italy has fiendishly complicated politics. Alter Auditore, is there a possibility of Turkey entering Yemen? I want to give a firm no to that one. Yeah, I think I'd give a pretty firm no on that one. Because that would mean like real military conflict with Saudi Arabia or potentially the UAE. The United States wouldn't like it. I think the UK and the United States are currently enforcing naval blockade of Yemen. That's not now. I don't think that's a real possibility. It's interesting because something that's sort of underappreciated is that the Turkish invasion in Libya that has tremendous resonance for Turkish nationalists because the sort of end game of the Ottoman Empire, right before they lost all of the Balkans, or what was left of the Balkans in 1912, was Italy took, their desperate losing fight against Libya in 1908. Against Italy in Libya, because Italy took Libya from the Ottomans in 1908. And Yemen is both in the 1500s and in the 1800s. Yemen was a sort of a Vietnam type place for them. Like there's Turkish folk songs that talk about women losing their sons in Yemen. So I think Yemen is interestingly a place that the Ottomans, that like Ottoman nationalist, curious politicians like Erdogan might be very interested in getting involved in. But at the current point, I think the prospects for involvement in Yemen are very unlikely. Where is Logacool's? Where is Logacool's extreme question? No, not seeing it. Weird. All right. Well, I think we've been doing this for almost 2 hours, and my understanding is that it is less likely that people will look at it if it's over 2 hours. So I think we're going to wrap up. No, I got another super chat, so I'll keep going. Is BRICS dead after India-China conflict? BRICS has always been kind of a weird thing. Like BRICS, the concept of the BRIC countries was invented by some investor, I think, in the late 90s, early aughts, where he's like, ooh, the next coming countries for economic development are Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRIC country. And then they put South Africa at the end there, the BRICS. And I think weirdly, the leaders of the government liked the concept so much that they started meeting up and but like, yeah, I don't think BRICS is something we're likely to hear too much more about. I don't think it is a particularly active like multilateral involvement anyway. But I think isn't like India, I was just read somewhere, isn't India in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Like I think we shouldn't overstate it's a big deal. I mean like I think 50 to 100 people died in like gun-free brawls up in the top of the world between India and China. But I do think that just the fact they did not use firearms. I think that both countries are very conscious of not wanting to escalate things. I think that it's terrible. As I made a video last Tuesday, it's terrible for China's. I think it is terrible for China's soft power it's terrible for China's soft power to be like in a border dispute with India. That reminds everybody that surrounds China that, oh, China's big and powerful and angry about its borders. And I do think that it will impact interactions between China and India in ways that are good for the United States in a very zero-sum kind of way. But like BRICS, I don't think BRICS as a multilateral organization had ever had that much existence. So what will be more interesting is like, okay, so what happens in how often, I think the annual meetings of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China's sort of alternative to NATO. I just don't know. Or is India just an observer? So absolutely, there'll be very real effects for the Chinese-Indian relationship, but we shouldn't go overboard to be like, oh, it's all over between the two of them, because it's in their interest to work together on certain things. So don't know. James Cook, I don't know what the Quiddly Party is, so I don't know anything about that. Okay, well, I think we are done for the day. It has been almost 2 hours. Fantastic talking to you all. I'm very grateful for all the super chats. I'll be honest, like giving up my apartment and like some other personal stuff, feeling a little down. But it's nice, people appreciate me. You guys like me. Anyway, so yeah, it's nice to be here talking to all of you, answering good questions, getting in weird arguments in the comments. Yeah, thank you. I'm very grateful. My name is Robert Morris. You can find me here every Tuesday. I normally don't do normally my Tuesday video isn't one of these live chats, which take much less work than my produced videos. But this week, yes, this is my Tuesday video. Normally there are produced videos that are more in depth. I hope to be covering Yemen coming up, Sudan. I've got some U.S. Politics videos coming up, obviously. I hope you'll all be here. Please subscribe and click the bell next to the subscribe button. If you want to be part of the ongoing conversation, you can find me on Twitter at RoboLaw. I am perhaps too active there. Spend a little too much time on Twitter, but always eager to interact with folks over there. You can find me on Instagram at The Golden Age. I don't really interact that much over there, but there's a lot of stories of me drawing things. I don't know why you'd be interested in that, but there's that. I have written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, available on Amazon in paperback and Amazon Kindle form. I think it really kind of like describes like the history of the world for the past 200 years. I think it's pretty good. One of the nice things about the coronavirus thing is that I've had people reaching out to me being like, yo, Rob, I finally had time to read your book and it's good. So yeah, you should take a look at that. I've also got a shorter book called Everybody's Lying About Islam that talks about the U.S. Saudi relationship. I will be doing this again next week, but I will only be doing it for patrons. I have decided to try to offer more to more Patreon only content. So yeah, there is we did it last month and it was pretty cool. It was like this, but it was more of like a news brief section. Like I went through the month's news from a number of countries that I tend to cover here, or just other stuff that I felt was worth talking about. And so like I did news briefs, sort of like, okay, what do I think about these developments? And then because it's just the patrons, we only had like 15, 20 people. So I could like really have a conversation with people as we went through, instead of just sort of like, what did somebody say at some point? So yeah, that is a patrons only live chat that is available. And you can, wow, thank you, Tariq El Solbi. That's very generous. Another great super chat. Thank you so much. What was fun to say? Oh shit, I missed Fatel's super chat. Fuck. Sorry. Where Fatel super chat? Okay. Fatel asks, with Balkan growth stagnated, what will happen now? Sorry, apologies, Fatel. I don't know too much about the Balkans. There's a buddy of mine I follow on Twitter who seems like somebody in the Trump administration might actually be pushing forward some progress in the Balkans, sort of a discussion between Serbia and Kosovo, which would be amazing. I think that the most important thing, and I think the most important thing for the Balkans is for the EU to step up accession. Obviously, the EU, one of the main problems of the EU is that too many people in it too quickly. But the addition of Balkan countries is, I mean, these are countries with very small populations. Croatia is already in there. Serbia is under 10 million, and I think that's the biggest of all the countries that are left. Obviously, just make it a longer accession path, make it a 20-year accession path, because a lot of these countries have a lot of issues that need to be resolved before they join. But I think what's unwise and is destabilizing for the Balkans is the fact that I think Macron and maybe some other, that might be unfair, he might have done the opposite, but Macron and some other folks have been like, oh, the EU is absolutely not starting any kind of accession talks. That's not good. I think the Balkan progress towards peace is related to EU accession stuff. With Balkan growth stagnated, what will happen now? I mean, unfortunately, much of Europe has serious stagnation issues. So yeah. So next week there will be a patrons only live chat, and there freaking better also be a produced video. On Tuesday, Twitter at Rabalaw, Instagram at The Golden Age, and please buy my books. Please sign up for my Patreon. You can also donate on PayPal. There's links to that sort of thing below. And I am tremendously grateful to all of you for showing up and for all the super chats. I think we got more than $100 worth of super chats this week. It's pretty amazing. That's awesome. That'll buy me a week of food, and because now I'm essentially living between my parents' houses at this point. That's awesome. So thank you. Very grateful, and yeah, thank you so much. And we are ending the stream now. Thank you.